The chandeliers blazed above the royal banquet when the prince's young son, in front of lords and ladies clad in silk, turned to his humble nanny and called her Mom. Gasps cut through the hall, silverware froze in mid-air, and every jeweled eye turned on the woman in plain linen who had dared to inspire such affection. At the head of the table, the Dowager Duchess rose, her voice sharp with scorn, vowing that such a scandal would not be tolerated. Clara, trembling yet unbroken, clutched the child's hand, a figure of tenderness crushed beneath the weight of power. But that single innocent word would ignite a storm that no crown, no court, and no threat could contain. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. Candles burned like captured stars above the long table, their light doubling in the polished silver and the lake-dark sheen of decanters. The palace dining hall breathed with ritual, a low tide of voices, the scrape of cutlery, the faint hiss of the hearth. Clara stood one pace behind the small chair at the prince's right hand, where the boy sat with his feet not quite touching the floor. She kept her hands folded, fingers pressed, posture quiet as a prayer. She had been told from her first hour among these damask walls that a good nurse is a shadow. Tend to the child, not the room. Be present, not seen. From this vantage, the world was a tapestry woven without her thread. Chairs creaked under brocade and velvet as lords settled their shoulders. Jewels caught candlelight like secret storms. The Dowager Duchess's profile, an iron coin, watched the length of the table. Clara could smell orange peel from the recently cleared course, and under that, the faintly sour tang of wine. The boy shifted, lifting his spoon and placing it down again with soft, steady taps that matched his breath. He was trying, she knew, to be good. Goodness was a posture here, as exacting as a uniform. She leaned, just enough to adjust the napkin that had slipped from his knee. The linen was crisp and cool under her fingertips. The child glanced up at her with the tight look he wore when the room pressed too close. She did not speak. She only nodded once, a tiny anchor dropped in a deep, bright sea. The prince's profile, the curve of cheek, the stillness of his mouth, did not turn. He never turned during a formal dinner. That was the rule. Rules were how things held. Rules were the ropes that bound a world from shaking apart. A footman passed with a tray of steaming fish, and the scent sifted through the hall. The boy barely looked at it. He was counting, she realized. He often counted when he felt small. The columns, the panels, the flickers of candle flame in each mirror. She remembered how he had once counted buttons on her sleeve, lips moving, and then looked up at her, as if the number were a secret they shared. Her throat tightened. She let her hand hover near the back of his chair, not touching almost. If he glanced up again, he would see her palm open like a tiny shelter. Across the hall, whispers stitched themselves into the length of the evening. Names of estates, murmured references to votes, who would marry whom now that a certain dowry had thinned. The air was a map of alliances. Clara mapped the little things. The boy's shoulders were too straight for a child. He was holding the pose he thought the room demanded. A slip of his foot, the swing to steady himself, almost knocked his spoon. She caught it before it fell, her fingers brushing the cool metal, her hand retreating just as quickly. "Drink," she breathed, the word so soft it might have been a thought. He reached for his water glass as if it were a lifeline. His sleeve brushed her, warm wool. She did not move her hand to help him. He drank, and when he set the glass down, she saw his breath ease. The dowager's eyes slid, landed briefly on Clara's headscarf, on the plain ribbon at her collar. The glance was not a blade exactly, it was a measure. Clara lowered her gaze. She felt the glance like a weight laid on the back of her neck, the way her father used to set the Bible on the lectern, a gravity that could not be argued with, only borne. She lifted the boy's fork 1 inch, placed it closer to his hand, so he would not reach and clatter. "Is it very long?" he whispered without moving his mouth. She tilted the water jug and answered with the smallest nod. This would not be a night that ended soon. The prince had called for the full ceremony because a delegation from the north had arrived. There were toasts to be made and resentments to be sluiced with wine. The boy had been asked to attend as a symbol. Sons were symbols in palaces. Children, in rooms like this, carried futures without being allowed to carry their own napkins wrong. Clara lifted her eyes. The prince's hand lay near the rim of his plate, bare of rings save for the signet that sat like a sealed truth on his smallest finger. His other hand, hidden in his lap, must have been folded in the way he had of holding steady against what could not be controlled. There was quiet on his face. People called it dignity. She recognized, beneath it, the thin line of endurance. When he had first set eyes on her, a stranger carrying his son, his grief had been a raw, each-breath event. It had receded into formality, but formality could not change the shape of absence. "Foot down," she murmured, because the boy's heel was braced against the chair's rung with a tension that would leave his calves cramping. He lowered it. She let the ghost of a smile pass across her mouth. He saw it and answered, not with a smile, too risky, too visible, but with a fractional looseness in his shoulders. A ladle clinked. A chair leg scraped too loudly. A lord at the far end laughed at a remark that must have been sharp, because then every other smile was too careful. The air held like a held note. Clara's body learned to match the room, still where it needed stillness, light where attention slid. She did not notice the itch in her back or the warmth creeping up her neck. She noticed the tiny tremor in the boy's hand as he reached for bread. "Allow me," the prince said to someone, and Clara felt the sound of his voice move through her like a chord struck. Her focus returned to the plate before the boy, small slices arranged like a lesson in restraint. He took one, chewed, swallowed with visible effort. She would have liked very much to lead him into air, just one turn through the corridor, the whisper of a window sash raised and lowered, "Breathe with me." But the hall closed around them like a bell. A footman for the desert stood ready, the gleam of sugar confections under overturned glass domes. The boy's eyes jumped toward them and back again, quick as a bird's. She leaned closer, and he exhaled through his nose, the quiet signal of relief he gave when she understood. The signal meant only this: "You are here." It meant more than Clara could bear if she said it aloud. Her father had told her once, when she was a child listening to rain beat the vicarage roof, that the simplest words are the most difficult to keep. Bread, home, mother. She had been a little girl with knuckles chapped from winter and had thought the word mother sounded like the warm side of a door. She had grown up through rooms where that door did not exist. She did not grow bitter. Bitterness would have been a waste, a thing to trip over in narrow halls. But the shape of that absence still sat somewhere in the muscles of her throat, like a swallowed pebble. A nod from the prince toward the chief steward signaled the approach of the toasts. Glasses lifted. The dowager's voice conducted the room with effortless precision. Words about the kingdom's prosperity, about duty. The boy's attention drifted, then snapped back, because he was clever, and because he wanted not to disappoint. Clara counted breaths with him for a few seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. When his lashes fluttered, she tensed without deciding to, ready to signal a servant for more water, ready to whisper the least of orders. "Look at the candle," so as to draw him back. "Steady," she whispered. He tilted his head minute degrees, a bird listening. The prince rose for his part, and the hall's sound drew down to a thin sound like the sea far away. He spoke of the visitors with courtesy that bent not an inch more than custom required. He did not speak of his household. He did not speak of anything that touched the raw edge of his life. Clara kept her eyes on the boy's plate and knew that the act, this closing of the door between public obligation and private ache, cost him. The boy's foot rubbed against the chair rung again and again, a tiny rasp. She placed her hand on the back of his chair, and the rubbing stopped. He leaned imperceptibly toward her hand. She did not move it. They were a small island built out of posture and breath. He lifted his head to look up the table, and she saw the moment his gaze caught on the dowager's profile. He swallowed. The dowager did not look back. A low cough at the far end, another servant replacing a candle that had guttered. A decoration of laurel leaves twined along the center of the table sent out a green scent when the air moved. Clara let her lungs fill. The hall tasted of starch and citrus, of beeswax and threaded roses carried in on someone's cuffs. She kept the scent in her mouth as if it were something she could hand the boy. "Do you remember the rule for toasts?" she asked in the faintest of murmurs, so slight the words laid along his ear like feathers. "Don't drink," he breathed back. "Just lift the glass." "That's right." He kept his eyes on his father. The prince sat down, and the room relaxed in a collective clearing of throats. Another toast, a clink repeated like a bell across silver. Clara's hand dropped to her side. She let her eyes lift, as if by accident, and found the prince's gaze waiting there. It was no more than a heartbeat. His face did not change. He looked away. In that small beat of attention, the world creaked on a different hinge. He should not look at her in public. She should not lift her eyes to his. The knowledge of those should-nots made the glance feel like standing near the edge of a cliff and seeing one small white flower growing out of rock. "Miss Whitfield," someone murmured behind her without moving their lips. Not to her, but near her. A warning disguised as a courtesy. The voice faded. So did her brief sense of air. The boy's spoon slipped this time and would have clattered hard, but her hand came in sure and quick, soundless as a breath. His fingers brushed hers. He looked straight at her, half a question opening in his eyes, the kind children do not yet know to bind. She gave the smallest smile, the one that meant "I understand." A heartbeat later, the prince's attention cut toward them, as if following the thread of that touch. Clara's lungs forgot to draw air. "Careful," the prince said, softly enough that the words were for his son, but not to be missed by the row nearest them. The boy nodded once. It should have put things back into their proper grooves. It should have. He sat up straighter, his face thin with effort. The dowager's gaze found Clara again like a compass needle finding north. Clara kept her head still and thought of rain against the vicarage roof, of the sound of bread torn by honest hands, of words too simple to say aloud in rooms like this. One more toast, one more polite applause. A servant bent to murmur to the chief steward, eyes flicking toward the prince's end of the table with that particular caution servants have when measured in rooms that can ruin them with a glance. The steward nodded and signaled for the sweet course to be borne in its procession, fruits laced with syrup, a shy pudding trembling, a tower of sugared chestnuts like small moons. The boy's attention snagged there again, and he steadied it because he was being watched. Clara felt the turn in him before it traveled to his face. His small shoulder lifted, lowered. The hall blurred for one instant around the point where he sat. She knew that feeling. It was the cliff edge where an impulse leaped before it scanned the map of rules. The chair beside the boy scraped back half an inch. He twisted in his seat, his mouth opening along the line of a sigh. One syllable reached his tongue and stayed there. She shook her head very slightly. "Not here, not now." "Please, love." He looked at her, and his eyes, wide and earnest, and loved into steadiness over months of grief that had torn his sleep and his appetite, found the word he needed to feel safe. "Mom," he said, soft and sure, into the lit air. It was not loud. It did not have to be. The sound struck the polished distance of the hall and flew the length of it like a lit match. For a moment nothing moved. The candles burned with a soundless vertical certainty. Then the room breathed, indrawn, shocked, almost hungry, and the ripples began. A fork set down a fraction too hard, a throat clearing that was not a cough, a murmur racing like dry grass catching. Clara felt nothing at all for half a second, as if her bones had turned to glass, and then she felt everything. Heat, cold, a clench in her stomach, the absurd urge to hush the entire world, as if it were a child who had been startled. The boy watched her with the serene relief of a question answered, only now realizing the shape of the silence around him. His eyes flicked to his father's face and back in quick alarm. Clara lowered her head. "Drink," she whispered, a fragment of order to thread through the chaos. He obeyed at once, lifting the glass with both hands, his fingers trembling. On the other side of the child's chair, the prince had not moved. His expression did not change. She could see not his thoughts, but the exact steadiness he wore like a coat against weather. He leaned half an inch toward his son. "For the next course," he said evenly to the steward who had paused, unwilling to be seen as hesitating, "we will proceed." The steward blinked once, bowed, and stepped away into his duty like a man stepping onto a narrow plank. The procession began again, wooden wheels squeaking faintly on polished boards. Conversation returned in little bursts. "Poor mite," someone breathed with a pleasure that did not match the pity. "Improper," another voice said with relish. "Children do not know." A softer murmur, and then, "But the nurse should." Clara kept her hands still. She wanted to place them on the child's shoulders and shield him from sound with something as impossible as love made into a wall. She wanted to vanish from the hall with such complete obedience to invisibility that no one could see her to judge her with their smirks and gentle tongues. She did neither. She stayed as she had been told to stay. She looked at the boy. She said nothing. The Dowager Duchess's chair did not creak as she stood. She did not need sound to draw every eye. Her presence did that. She lifted her hand, and silence fell with a thud. The visiting delegation ceased mid-murmur. Servants froze. A single drip of condensation slid down a decanter and hit the tray with a noise as loud as a dropped coin. She gazed down the length of the table past silver urns and carved pheasant, past dotted faces, past the boy, past Clara, to her son. The prince met her eyes. Something like warning passed between them, or perhaps it was simply a memory of a younger man and a mother who had taught him how to carry a room's weight with his spine. The dowager turned her face toward Clara without moving her body. It felt like a cold window opening in winter. "Enough," she said, and that one word emptied the scattered whispers from the room as if she had lifted a stopper. The prince spoke, quiet and under control. "Mother." The dowager did not look away. "An incident," she said, her voice precise enough to cut. "An error of familiarity which the child cannot be expected to understand." Her gaze did not blink. "But an error which must be corrected." Clara stared at the table edge, because she did not know where else to put her eyes. There was a grain in the wood that ran like a river, darker than the rest. She followed it with her gaze until it disappeared under a place where a platter's weight had worn it smooth. "Your Grace," the prince said, words like stone placed carefully. "This is neither the time nor the—" "It is precisely the time," the dowager said, and the slight hardening of her tone made the words carry into the far reaches of the gallery. "When a boundary is broken in public, it must be repaired in public." The boy, frightened by the new cold in the air, put down his glass. He looked from his father's face to Clara's, reading the room as he had been taught, finding no place to stand. Clara let her fingers relax on the back of his chair, the only signal she could give him. "We will not vanish." The dowager now moved, one step not hurried, each fold of her gown rehearsed into quiet. She did not need to raise her voice. Power does not shout. The room leaned toward her with the helplessness of ivy clinging to ancient stone. She raised her hand slightly, and a servant, because servants move when hands lift, took one half-step forward and then froze, caught between visible obedience and the fear of being seen. Clara could feel the prince beside her without turning, his attention a steady line like a guardrail on a cliff path. He did not reach for her arm. He did not reach for his son. He did not move. That steadiness was its own choice. A lord at the far end coughed into his napkin to hide a smile that was not kind. Another dug his finger absently under his collar as if his shirt had become too tight. The visiting men watched with eyes that flicked between the strength of a court and its tenderest weakness, learning a country in one moment of slip and ritual. When the dowager spoke again, the words were smooth as glass and cold as it too. "This cannot be allowed," she said. "Bring her to my chambers at once." The hall did not exhale. It held its breath around the dowager's command, as if the stone itself were listening. The boy's hand tightened around his glass. Clara felt that small pressure through the air, as surely as if his fingers had closed on hers. A footman she knew by his careful way of walking approached her left shoulder and stopped short of touching her arm. "Miss Whitfield," he said, eyes on the floor. "If you please." She lowered her head. There was no room for a reply beyond obedience. The boy leaned toward her, a bird turning toward a hedge in wind. "I'll come back," she murmured, too low for anyone but him to hear. His lips formed the beginning of a word and then closed. He swallowed. The prince did not look at her as she stepped back from the chair, as if his not looking were a shield he could hold between her and the room. She followed the footman, the soles of her shoes skimming the polished floor, the back of her neck prickling under the court's measured curiosity. The corridor took the sound of the hall and thinned it. The further they went, the more the evening became a series of small noises. The whisper of her skirt against the runner, the click of the footman's buckle, the draught that slipped under a door and kissed her ankle with cold. Lamps made low golden islands in the long carpet of night. A second servant fell in to lead the way at a respectful distance. No one spoke. When they turned toward the private apartments, the tapestries swallowed their shapes, the chase of stags, the woven hunt, dogs forever about to leap. At the dowager's door, the footman raised his hand and waited. When the chamberlain within opened, he bowed quickly, as if to show he had done as required and could not be accused of slowness. Clara crossed the threshold into a room where the air was cooler, stripped of the hall's perfumes. The dowager stood before the hearth like a pillar that had always been there. "Miss Whitfield," she said, and the way she pronounced the name made it sound like a tool placed on a table. Useful, not personal. Clara stopped 3 paces away and folded her hands. Her tongue felt too large in her mouth, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Your Grace." The dowager did not invite her to sit. She did not sit herself. The chamber was a study of restraint, the clock's quiet heart, the faint singe of a candle wick recently snuffed and trimmed, the neat stack of pages on a small side table with a pen aligned alongside them as if measurement itself could keep the world in order. "What occurred?" the dowager said, each word weighed. "In the hall just now is not a matter that can be left to domestic management." Clara lowered her eyes. "No, Your Grace." "You have been told, I trust, upon what footing you were engaged." "Yes, Your Grace." "And yet the child," the dowager's mouth made no more movement than necessary, "has attached to you in a manner that is unusual." Clara felt the need to choose each word with the care one would use to carry a glass bowl across ice. "The child is grieving, Your Grace. Children attach where they feel safe." The dowager's gaze shifted a fraction, as if she were studying the flame's behavior in a draft. "Safety does not require the borrowing of a name that he is not permitted to use." Clara stared at the pattern in the carpet and counted the stitches in a border, 5, 6, 7, so her voice would not tremble. "I have never taught him to use it, Your Grace." "Whether you taught him or not," the dowager said, "is of less importance than the visible fact that he did, and that no hand, yours, prevented him." Clara heard the unspoken lines. "You could not stop a child in the instant his need leaped. You are answerable for an instant." She lifted her head a shade. "He spoke in a moment of distress. I corrected him at once." "Your correction," the dowager returned, "did not reach the ears that mattered." Clara swallowed. "I can be more vigilant." "You can be replaced," the dowager said. The clock gave one small tick that seemed louder than it should have been. Clara did not let her eyes flick to it. "If I may, Your Grace," she said, and felt the edge of daring under the smallness of the words. "The child will suffer for a second loss." The dowager's eyes did not soften. "Children suffer. They also learn. You, however, are not a child. You must learn faster." Clara held her breath for 2 counts and let it out again. She thought of the boy's hand, always cold at the first hour of sleep. She thought of his breath against her sleeve when nightmares woke him. She thought of the prince's silence, a veil drawn between his grief and the court's appetite to see it. "I will take any instruction Your Grace gives," she said, "and obey it." "Instruction," the dowager said, almost to herself, "cannot make some facts untrue." She moved to the side table and lifted a sheet of parchment without reading it. It could have been any sheet. The gesture mattered more than the content. She placed it down again, aligning the corner with the table's edge, as if to demonstrate how a thing ought to lie. "You will remain in your rooms tonight," she said. "You will not visit the nursery." Clara felt the ground tilt under a surface that had feigned steadiness. "Your Grace, he will not sleep." "The child," said the dowager, "will sleep under his father's household, not under your shadow. A nurse is a function. We do not mistake functions for family." The words slid over Clara like cold water and left her bones aching. "Yes, Your Grace. You will be sent for in the morning." "Am I dismissed?" The dowager's expression did not flicker. "You are not dismissed." The relief landed and then slid sideways. Not dismissed was not the same as safe. It meant only that the decision was delayed, and delay had its own cruelty. "That will be all," the dowager said, as if the conversation had been about candles or accounts. Clara curtsied and turned to leave. As she reached the door, the dowager's voice touched her back like frost. "The boy will forget, Miss Whitfield. It is his duty to forget." Clara bowed her head. "Yes, Your Grace." She stepped into the corridor and closed the door without sound. The breath she had been holding left her like steam in cold air. The footman did not meet her eyes. He stood ready to escort, a piece of the palace's machinery. "Miss," he said softly, "this way." They moved in pairs of footsteps. Somewhere behind the walls, the hall still murmured. A curving stair brought them to a corridor close by the nursery, and at the first bend she saw a maid with quick hands and kind, tired eyes look up, startled. "Is he—" Clara began. The maid shook her head in a small, apologetic movement. "Orders. He is with his father's valet." Clara pressed her lips together. The maid's mouth tightened in sympathy. "He cried," the maid whispered, as if the walls could be offended by the truth. "Then he stopped. Then he cried again." Clara thanked her with a look. The footman coughed, embarrassed by witnessing what could not be adjusted like a candlestick. He turned to lead her toward the small room off the nursery wing where she slept. The runner yielded under her weight. Lamps burned with a low steadiness that made the nights in this palace seem longer than honest nights should be. At the second turn, she paused. The air behind the tapestry to her left stirred, then stilled. It was a draft, she told herself, and then the tapestry lifted a quarter inch and fell back. She should have moved on. "Miss Whitfield," said a voice she knew, quiet as a man testing the strength of silence. She turned. The prince stood in the shadow of the stair, without a retinue, without even the disguise of noise to announce him. His face was the careful blank he wore when he had already chosen not to show more. "Your Highness," she said, her throat suddenly dry. The footman vanished into a position that was not quite absence. The maid faded into the angle of the corridor. Even the lamps seemed to draw back. "Walk with me," the prince said. Clara dipped her head. He did not offer his arm. He did not look at her. They moved side by side along the narrow corridor where the nursery wing met the older spine of the palace. Here the floorboards had a slight give. Here, old windows let in a thin breath of honest night. Their steps made small sounds that echoed and returned like questions. "You saw my mother," the prince said. "Yes, Your Highness." "How did she receive you?" Clara allowed a fraction of pause. With clarity. The prince's mouth twitched, not in humor, exactly. She has clarity in abundance. Your Highness, Clara said, keeping her eyes forward. I did not teach him the word. I would not. He stopped, and she stopped because he had. He turned his face slightly toward her, enough that she could see the lines fatigue had drawn at the corners of his eyes. I know, he said, so simply that the words reached her like warmth in cold fingers. She let out a breath she had been saving since the hall. The corridor narrowed where a door bowed inward, old wood proud in its age. He spoke again, not looking at her now. I did not look at you, he said, because the hall would have made the look into something it could eat. I understood, she said. So did my mother, he answered dryly, and then the dryness was gone. I am sorry. The apology startled her. She had not expected it. There is no need. There is every need, he said, too quickly, then tempered himself. The burden fell on you. He is my son. He is, she said. The two words did more work than any speech could have done. They stood a moment with them, as if they were looking at a small bridge that might bear weight. He will not sleep, she said. I know, he answered. Your mother. He cut in very softly. I know. She watched the window. The moon's light silvered the lid lines into a web. He called out once last month when his fever rose, she said, the memory present in her chest as if she were still that minute. He said that word into the dark because he could not remember any other that would carry him back to a person. The prince's breath went out audibly. The world will ask him to forget that word and punish him when he fails, she said. They were silent. The corridor carried their quiet like a bowl. Far on the other side of the wall, a clock marked the same minute twice as if reluctant to move on. Miss Whitfield, the prince said, tone formal because his instinct was not. I am grateful for your care. You needn't. I do. She folded her hands. He watched the gesture, then looked away as if it were too naked, too much like the boy's hand closing on hers. I will speak with my mother, he said. She will not yield, Clara said without accusation. She will not, he agreed, but she will hear me. He started to walk again. They came to a door, closed. Beyond it, Clara knew, was the short stair that led to the tiny sitting room she used when the child slept and the household was quiet. He paused there as if uncertain which way to send her, not because he did not know the plan of the palace, but because the plan of the night had shifted under his feet. If it is required, Clara said carefully, I can leave. The child, he would suffer, but he would learn to sleep without me. The court would ease. He listened to the words and tightened his hand where it hung at his side. And you, he said. She lifted her chin a little. I would find work somewhere else. There are children everywhere. And men who will think a woman who can carry a prince's son through night can carry their households, he said, tone cool to hide heat. She shook her head. I am not a ladder. No, he said, you are not. They stood in the still corridor with the world's choices written in invisible ink on the air between them. His next words were very plain. Do not leave. A small flicker of shock passed through her, as bright and brief as a match. Your Highness, she began. Do not leave, he repeated, lower. I ask it. The words should not have been spoken here, in this narrow place where a draft turns candles to wavering commas, where footsteps might come around the corner. But they had been spoken. They hung between them with a weight that could not be lifted without leaving a bruise. Clara let herself nod once only. I will not. Their eyes met for a second that was too long for safety and too short to be a comfort. He stepped back, giving the space back to the palace. Go to your rooms, he said. I will see to him. Thank you, she said, and meant something simpler and wider than the phrase could carry. He did not touch the door. He did not bow. He did not need to. She went through and felt, as she closed it behind her, how the old wood's latch caught and held as if the house itself approved of doors that shut softly. Her room was small and square, the bed neatly turned, the washstand ready, the single chair under the casement. She sank onto the chair and let her body know it was allowed to feel. Out the window, the garden was a deeper dark against the sky. She heard nothing from the nursery, which was only a corridor and a stair away. That nothing was its own sound. She sat with it until her bones stopped ringing. Then she rose and loosened the ribbon at her collar so she could breathe more easily. The palace's nights had a rhythm she had learned since coming. Waves of silence, the slap of a late door, the hush of steps, then the heavier quiet when the last candle was checked. Tonight, the rhythm was broken. She could feel it in the air, as if a roomful of people had all begun to breathe at slightly different times. She washed her hands in water gone cool and watched the ripples fade. A scraped tread at her door made her straighten. She opened it. The maid from the corridor stood there with a pinched smile of apology. "I oughtn't," the maid whispered. "But I thought, he's quiet now." Clara's throat throbbed. "Thank you. He asked for you," the maid added very softly, as if to bring her the truth itself. "Then he slept without, because he had to." Clara closed the door on that knife of tenderness and leaned her forehead against the panel for a long moment. When she stretched out on the bed, she did not close her eyes. She watched the small rectangle of sky through the window and counted the long seconds between clouds. She must have slept at some point, because the next thing she knew, the light had thinned from black to a paler shade that made the window frame emerge from darkness, with shy outlines. Behind the walls, a far bell marked a new hour. The palace woke in groans and whispers. Grates opened, fires coaxed from ash, someone humming a line of a hymn under their breath and stopping when they remembered where they were. She sat up, smoothed her skirt, tied her ribbon again, and opened the door to the first cold of morning, which always felt cleaner than the day's later airs. In the corridor, 2 footmen went by with their shoulders already squared to the work of being invisible. A junior clerk hurried past, hugging a bundle of folded pages like a shield. He bobbed his head to her in reflex, and then looked startled at himself for doing it. She started toward the nursery and met the maid's eyes. The maid shook her head with regret. "Orders still hold, miss," she whispered. Clara inclined her head. The maid glanced down the corridor and back, then slipped, quick as a fish, a small thing into Clara's hand. Nothing more than a folded scrap of paper with a smudge, where a pencil had touched it and been rubbed away. Clara did not open it there. She slid it into her sleeve without thinking why. Only that kindness sometimes required secrecy in houses such as these. A measured tread came from the main stair. The prince's secretary, white-faced from early hours, came toward the nursery wing with an envelope on a tray, as if it were a relic. The wax seal shone red. The imprint on it looked like authority made visible. He did not look left or right. He went on to the prince's rooms. Clara stood still. The corridor went quiet in the way corridors do when they see a message pass. Then sound returned. The hush of skirts, the clink from a distant scullery, the child's soft exclamation in his sleep. No, she did not hear it. She imagined it. Imagining was a kind of hunger. A heartbeat later, the prince stepped into the corridor from his door. His hair lay smooth. His cravat was tied without flourish. He could have been any morning version of himself, but for the focus in his gaze, which had become like a line drawn with ink and left to dry. The secretary held out the tray. The prince took the envelope. For a second he weighed it in his hand as if even that could tell him what was inside. He broke the seal with his thumb and unfolded the heavy paper. His eyes went from line to line, and though his expression hardly altered, something changed the angle of his jaw. He lifted his head and looked down the corridor toward where Clara stood halfway in shadow. "The council has summoned me," he said. And then, after the barest pause that made the corridor lean in to hear, "And you." The summons had no weight in his hand, but it pulled like iron in his chest. Edward folded the paper once, twice, until it was no larger than his palm. He slipped it into his coat pocket, as if concealment might lessen its authority. Clara, standing against the wall, had not moved since he read her name. She looked as though she were bracing herself against a tide, head bowed slightly, shoulders straight only by force of will. "We will attend," he said, his voice steady, though steadiness cost him. She lowered her eyes. "Yes, Your Highness." The corridor carried silence around them. A maid passed quickly, eyes on the floor, as if afraid the stillness would catch fire. Edward watched Clara for a moment longer than safety allowed, then turned away. If he stayed, if he said what hovered unspoken in his throat, he would give the council more power than it already claimed. By the time the hour arrived, the palace had rearranged itself into ceremony. Livery was polished, boots shone, and the air itself seemed tighter, as if the stones of the palace had been told to stand at attention. Clara followed one pace behind Edward through the long gallery, the boy's absence heavy as an echo. Every servant they passed bent in acknowledgement, but their eyes flicked to Clara, then away too quickly. She felt their judgment like pins against her skin. The double doors of the council chamber opened with a groan of weight. Within, the long table stretched like a tribunal altar, polished to a mirror's gleam. The lords were already seated, coats dark, cravats starched into sharp lines, their expressions set into various degrees of disapproval. The Dowager Duchess sat at the right, her hands folded, her gaze unyielding. At the opposite end, the Duke of Armitage leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had been waiting for this very day. Edward entered first, every inch of his posture trained to project calm. Clara followed, and her presence caused a stir like a dropped stone in still water. Murmurs rose, quickly smothered by the council's self-importance. She stood at Edward's left, hands clasped before her, head bent. She felt every eye upon her as though she were a trespasser in a sanctum. "Your Highness," the Lord Chancellor intoned, "we thank you for answering our summons with such swiftness." Edward inclined his head with formality. "I am bound to my duty." "And the lady?" The Chancellor's eyes moved to Clara, his tone laced with doubt. "She was summoned by name," Edward replied, before Clara could attempt to speak. "She answers the same summons as I." A ripple ran through the table. The Chancellor coughed once, then began the inquiry. "It has reached the ears of the realm that a breach of decorum occurred within the great hall of this palace. A breach which, if unaddressed, threatens not merely the dignity of this household, but the stability of the crown's example." The words landed heavy, rehearsed, their meaning clear. This was not about one word spoken by a child. This was about appearances, about precedent, about the lines that divided classes as if heaven itself had drawn them. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to breathe evenly, but each inhalation felt stolen. Edward's jaw tightened. "You speak of my son." "We speak of what your son said." The Duke of Armitage cut in smoothly. His voice carried a satisfaction barely hidden beneath its courtesy. And more importantly, of why he felt permitted to say it. Children, after all, repeat what is reinforced. It is the duty of servants to know their place and to guard against such confusion. His gaze swept to Clara, and he let the pause sting. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she did not lower her head further. Her voice came quiet, but steady. "The child spoke in grief, your graces. He seeks a word he has lost. I did not teach him to say it. I would not dare." The Duke's lip curled. "And yet he said it, not once, but before the assembled court. We cannot blame a child. Therefore, we must question the influence under which he dwells." "Enough," Edward said, his tone soft, but edged with steel. "You question her as though she has plotted scandal. She has done no more than care for my son." The council shifted, some uneasy, some eager. The Lord Chancellor raised his hand for quiet. "Your Highness, none here question her diligence." But the matter is simple. A child may not mistake a servant for family. Allowing such confusion is to endanger the very order on which our society rests. We must insist the nurse be dismissed at once, for her sake as well as yours. Dismissed. The word fell like a blade. Clara's chest constricted. She held her breath, waiting for Edward's answer, knowing it would decide not only her future but the fragile sense of belonging the boy had found in her presence. Edward's silence stretched. His eyes lowered for one moment, as if the weight of choice pressed him down. Then he lifted them, gaze hard and clear. My son has known loss enough. He will not suffer another because this council fears the sound of a word. The Duke of Armitage leaned forward, seizing the opening. Your Highness, your defiance does you no credit. Sentiment is not governance. If you will not act, the council must. A line must be drawn, lest every household mistake affection for license. License? Edward's voice deepened. To what crime do you refer? That a child finds comfort? To the crime, Armitage said, of allowing sentiment to erode the dignity of the blood that sets you above the common herd. If you cannot contain your household, you risk the mockery of the realm, and I will not stand idle while the throne's dignity falters. The words echoed like a gauntlet thrown. Edward's hand curled into a fist against the table, though he did not raise it. Clara could feel the strain in the air, each noble leaning forward like hounds scenting blood. Then, before the Chancellor could interject, the chamber doors burst open. The sound cracked against the silence like a musket shot. Heads turned sharply. The boy stood in the doorway, his small frame framed by the heavy wood, his cheeks flushed from running. Behind him, a maid tried in vain to catch his sleeve. He looked past the crowd of grave faces, his gaze searching only for Clara. "Mom!" His voice rang high and clear, innocent and fierce. He rushed forward, skirts tangling around his legs, and flung himself against her skirts. Clara staggered under the sudden weight of him clinging, burying his face against her. The council erupted. Gasps, mutters, outrage broke the fragile formality. The Chancellor pounded his fist upon the table for order, but the sound was swallowed in the clamor. Clara froze, her hands trembling as she steadied the boy against her. She could feel his heartbeat hammering through his small body. She dared not speak. Edward's face went pale, then flushed with fury. His eyes swept the council like a storm breaking. "This is the truth you fear," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the uproar. "The love of a child, and you would punish it." The Duke of Armitage seized the moment, rising from his chair with predatory grace. His voice rose above the chaos. "If His Highness refuses to act, then I will. This matter shall not be left to whispers behind doors. I will bring it before Parliament itself, and let the realm see what softness has overtaken its prince." The room stilled at his words. Parliament. The threat was no longer confined to these walls. It had become a weapon aimed at Edward's honor, at Clara's life, at the very boy who clung to her. The chamber held its breath, waiting for Edward's reply, but none came. The Duke's ultimatum hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, and in that suspended moment, every future seemed to narrow to a single point. Edward did not blink. The Duke's words vibrated in the air like a string plucked too hard. The boy's small hands clenched in Clara's skirt. The council's faces leaned forward with appetite. Edward placed his fingertips against the table's edge to steady the impulse to strike something that could not strike back. "Enough," he said, not loudly, but with the authority of a man who had nothing left to yield. "This chamber will not make a spectacle of my son." The Lord Chancellor raised a hand. "Your Highness." "It will not," Edward repeated, and the quiet of the sentence snapped the room taut. He turned to Clara. "Take him." She shifted, but did not move until he added for the council's ears, "The nurse will remove the child from this hall. There will be no further display." The maid, white-faced, hovered at the threshold. Clara bent, unfastened the boy's locked hands with patience, whispered a thing the room could not hear, and coaxed him one step, then another. He looked back at Edward, a plea pressed into his gaze. Edward gave him the smallest nod, the nod that meant, "I see you." It was all he was allowed. The dowager rose half an inch, then stilled, watching the transfer of a child from care to corridor, as if it were a chess piece crossing a line that could not be recrossed. The Duke of Armitage's smile sharpened. "We have not concluded," the Duke said. Edward faced him. "You have concluded nothing. You merely threatened." "I gave warning," the Duke returned smoothly. "For the good of the realm." "For the good of your ambition," Edward said, and the murmur that followed could not decide whether to disapprove or admire. The Lord Chancellor, anxious to retrieve order, slid words between them. "Your Highness, the Council's concern is decorum. We ask only—" "You ask me to dismiss her," Edward said, making the request plain so it could not hide behind velvet. "You ask me to pretend the bond between my son and his nurse is a stain. You ask me to teach him that the word he reached for in fear is shameful. I decline." Silence pushed in. Edward let it sit. He could feel his mother's gaze close on him like a hand. "We shall reconvene," the Chancellor said at last, unwilling to fight a man refusing to fight. "When temper has cooled." Armitage laughed once under his breath. "Temper is not my difficulty." Edward inclined his head just enough to dismiss them all without appearing to run. "This session is concluded." He turned and left the table without waiting for permission. The chamber door closed behind him. The sound was too loud for his own taste, but he did not look back. In the corridor, the air was different, less perfumed, more honest. He breathed. Clara stood 10 paces away, his son's cheeks damp against her skirt. The maid kept respectful space, helpless in her kindness. Edward stopped. The sight of them, the small body pressed into white linen, Clara's hand steady at his back, was a truth he could have carried in a pocket if he had been allowed to carry anything that simple. "Leave us a moment," he said to the maid. She glanced down the hall, nervous of orders and eyes. "Yes, Your Highness." The boy lifted his face. "Don't send her away," he said, not loudly. Edward swallowed. The corridor's lamps made small halos against the plaster. The palace's old bones groaned as if remembering winters. "I'm not sending her away," he said. The boy searched his father's face. He had learned, too early, to read things for which children are not meant to have alphabets. Clara's hand tightened once against his shoulder, a signal to trust. "You will go with Mary," Edward said to his son, naming the maid without looking at her. "To the nursery. I will follow." The boy's mouth compressed. "With her?" Edward felt his mother's phantom disapproval in the air like cold, but he did not look toward it. "Yes," he said. Clara crouched. Her skirts brushed the floor. "We will count the steps," she whispered into the boy's ear, as if counting could lay plank after plank across a narrow bridge. 20 to the stair, 30 down, 10 more to the nursery door. The boy sniffed, nodded, put his small hand in Clara's. She rose with him, and together, with the maid hovering a respectful pace back, they turned. Edward watched them until they reached the turn and were gone. Then he set his shoulders and walked the other direction, toward the glass and the night. He needed air that had not been breathed by men who loved the shape of their own arguments. The doors to the garden gave under his hand with the slight resistance of heavy hinges that had done their duty for decades. Night met him. Clean, damp, unperfumed, except by the honest green of clipped hedges and the faint sweetness of late roses. He crossed the stone threshold and stood on the gravel, waiting for the surge in his chest to subside. Moonlight laid its mild arithmetic on the paths. Statues held their poses as if they were not tired of being looked at. He heard footsteps. Clara stepped out from the shadow of the limestone arch, her face pale in the soft light. She must have sent the boy with the maid and turned at once to follow. The door fell closed behind her with a soft kiss of wood on wood. For a moment they did not speak. "I should not have allowed him to run," she said finally. "You did not allow it," Edward answered. "He ran," He is 8. 7, she said, because accuracy mattered even in the dark. 7, he repeated. The correction made something in him ease. He looked at her. She stood without artifice, hands folded, shoulders set. The candlelight of the hall had always made her seem like a woman on whom light lay by accident. Here the moon gave her edges, and he felt the shape of her steadiness like a thing he could lean against if he were a different man. He will be punished by what happened, she said. Not by hands, by talk. I know, he said. You must protect him, she added, and then caught herself. You will. Of course you will. The small misstep, that she had told him to do what he already knew was his charge, hung between them, tender and terrible. He did not take offense. He took the measure of the trust she had in him and set it beside what the council had set before him. If my mother had her wish, he said, you would be gone before dawn. She believes pain instructed promptly is pain diminished. Clara's head tipped a fraction. And you believe? He looked past her into the garden's careful geometry. I believe some pains teach nothing. She was silent. He felt the tug of things unspoken, the ones with edges that cut when drawn into daylight. He drew one of them anyway. I am asked to dismiss you, he said, on the grounds that a child loved you too clearly. She lifted her chin a little. If you ask it, I will go. He heard the meaning beneath the sentence. Not for the council's comfort, for his peace. The thought of her leaving by his request made his stomach knot. I do not ask it, he said. A breath left her that might have been a thank you if she had permitted words like gratitude in moments like this. She stepped forward a little, enough that their shadows touched. For his sake, she said, because she had to make the case upon which everything could rest. Not for mine. For his sake, he agreed, and for mine. She looked up at him quickly, as if the ground had tilted. He had not planned to say it. It had come out like truth does when it has been held too long. You have restored him to breath, he said, speaking into the green-smelling dark. I have, since his mother's death, kept him alive by the clock, fed, walked, taught, measured. You taught him to laugh without apology. Clara's hands tightened in each other, and he saw a flicker of something like fear cross her face. Not fear of him, but of what words, spoken aloud, could build. He laughs because he is a child, she said. He laughs because you are a woman who knows how not to make a child into a symbol. The sentence hung between them like a bridge in mist. She did not step onto it. Neither did he. The rules did not go to sleep simply because the moon was bright. If I remain, she said carefully, you will be made to answer for it. I will answer, he said. To whom? To anyone who demands. Your mother will demand, she said softly. She already has. He returned. They walked without a plan along the path where the gravel gave a small, honest crunch underfoot. Edward clasped his hands behind his back to keep them from reaching for a comfort that was not his to take. He listened to the garden's small sounds, the troop of a hedgehog through a hedge, the drip from a stone urn where the gardener's can had spilled earlier and left a small reserve of water in a hollow. Had the council sat under this sky, he thought, would they have spoken more gently? He doubted it. Men do not become different men under the moon. At the far turn, where a yew threw a triangular shade, Clara stopped. If I stay, she said, I will be careful to the edge of caution. He will not call me that word again in rooms where it can be used against him. You cannot stop his mouth, Edward said. I can teach him to stop it himself, she answered. Not by shame, by understanding. Words live where they are allowed. I will show him where a word must rest. The simplicity of her plan, kindness disciplined, moved him more than eloquence. He nodded. Yes. They stood again, together, quiet. The garden felt like a room that had agreed to listen and tell no one. He turned toward the door at last. I will speak to my mother, he said. Tonight? Yes. She will be as she is. He smiled without showing teeth. Unimprovable. Clara's mouth softened at the corners. She loves you. She loves the house we stand in, he answered. She believes loving me is the same thing. I have not always argued. And now? Now, he said, and did not finish. They went back through the door, and the house's warmer air came around them with a faint taste of wax and old wood. At the corridor's fork, he stopped. Go to the nursery, he said. If you are turned away, wait in your sitting room. Do not go far. She looked as though she would rather argue, then bowed her head. Yes, Your Highness. He watched her go until the turn took her. Then he turned the other way. The dowager's apartments were lit, which meant she expected him. Her chamberlain admitted him without announcing him. She stood by the mantel with a letter in her hand she was not reading. Mother, he said. Edward. The syllables carried both the man and the boy he had been. They did not exchange pleasantries. The hour was too late for that, and the thing between them too sharp. You are determined, she said. Yes. To defy the council. To refuse to harm my son in order to keep men comfortable, he corrected. She set the letter down, aligning it with the table's edge. You mistake the matter. Comfort is not the end. Structure is. Children must be taught the borders of their world. He is 7, Edward said. The border of his world is grief. Grief, she answered, does not excuse the erosion of order. He stepped closer to the fire's mild light. It warmed his face without changing its shape. Order is not harmed by kindness. Kindness, she said, and her tone made the word a thing examined, is a virtue in private. In public it becomes confusion. We are in private, he said. Our house is never private, she returned. You know that. He did. He hated it. He called her a word, he said softly. You would tear out the tongue that reaches for comfort and call it virtue. She did not flinch. I would teach it to speak in season. He breathed in. I will not dismiss her. The line of her mouth thinned. You will not. No. And when men call you weak, she asked. When they say a prince was led by a woman in a plain gown who smiles at a child? He met her gaze. Then they will have said words, and I will still have my son's trust. She watched him with the expression she had worn when he was 14 and had refused to apologize for a thing he had done deliberately to spare a tenant humiliation. You have always been obstinate in the direction of your own heart, she said. I have often failed it, he replied. That is true, she said, not unkindly. He waited. She lifted her chin the smallest degree. You will keep her, she said. Very well. Then you will do so with a precision that gives no comfort to gossips. She will not dine in halls. She will not be in places where those who are hungry for stories can feed. Agreed, he said at once. You may count on my restraint. I always have, she returned. He knew then that he had won the most he could win tonight. He did not press. Thank you. She did not acknowledge the thanks because the word did not sit well in her mouth. You will find that what you call courage is to some men mere spectacle. Do not invite that error. I will not, he said. And the Duke, she added, as if tossing a stone into a lake to see how far the ripples would go. He will do what men do who have discovered a lever, Edward said. I will not allow him to move the house with it. She watched him. You are my son. I am, he said. Go to your child, she said at last. He bowed. It felt less like deference than like the closing of a book one knows by heart. He turned out into the corridor, and the door closed softly behind him. Clara sat on the low chair by the nursery fire with the boy heavy in her lap, his breath the small, even rhythm that meant true sleep. She had not planned to take him up. He had laid his head against her arm on the rug and closed his eyes. The maid had lifted him and placed him into her waiting arms, as if they both understood that a chair and a lap sometimes make a harbor better than a bed. The room smelled of clean linen and a trace of lavender. Firelight marked the edges of toys set neatly aside before supper. She kept very still. Her back ached and had already stopped complaining. The child's hand, lax in sleep, still held the ghost of that earlier clutch. She looked at the small crescent of dirt under one finger, a remnant of the day's garden time that had escaped washing. The detail felt so human she wanted to laugh and cry at once. The door opened without a creak. Edward came in and stopped at the sight of them. His shoulders lowered a fraction, as if a weight had been set down near the door and told to wait until morning. "He is all right," Clara whispered. "I see," he said. He crossed the room and stood beside the chair, one hand braced on the mantel, not leaning, not because he did not need to, but because if he leaned, he would be a man leaning towards something forbidden. He looked at his son's face for a long moment. The boy's lashes lay dark on his cheeks. His mouth was open the smallest fraction, the way it always was when sleep went deep enough to loosen dignity. "I have spoken to my mother," he said at last, still looking down. "You will not be dismissed." Clara's eyes stung. "Thank you. For tonight," he added, because truth is better in small exact measures. "And tomorrow. And the day after. Until I say otherwise. She will not countermand me." Clara nodded, absorbing the shape of safety he could guarantee and the shape he could not. "I will be careful." "I know," he said. He bent very slightly and adjusted the boy's blanket, the small act practiced from 100 nights when he had done it in bigger grief. His hand grazed Clara's knuckles. Both hands withdrew an inch, as if burned by propriety. Neither apologized. The fire gave a soft pop and sent up a thread of scent like sugar browning. "You should sleep," he said. "Both of you." "I will sit a little," she answered. "He is heavy." "I can," he began, and stopped, because the end of the sentence was, "I can take him and carry him to bed," and the middle of the sentence was, "I do not want your arms to be empty." She smiled without showing teeth. "He never feels heavy until he is asleep. Then he becomes all truth." "That is accurate," he said, and the plainness of the exchange eased something tight in his chest. They were quiet. The clock on the mantel marked a minute with a tick so gentle it was more a suggestion than a sound. Edward let silence be their language for a while. He felt the council's words still on his skin like dust. He felt his mother's measure. He felt the steadiness of this small room like clean water. "I will be close by," he said. She nodded. "I know." He took one step back toward the door. Paused. "Clara," he said, speaking her name in a low voice that fit the room and the hour. She looked up. "Thank you," he said again, and this time the word meant the whole weight of a house that had not fallen because she had held one small corner of it with her hands. Her eyes filled and did not spill. "Good night, Your Highness." "Good night," he said. He left the door unlatched. The fire settled. The child's breathing deepened, then evened. Clara rested her cheek lightly against the top of his head and listened to the simplest sound in the world until her own breath matched it, and the house at last felt, for 1 hour, at peace. The morning of the assembly broke cold and bright. Frost clung to the windowsills, throwing back a cruel light that made the corridors seem sharper, the air thinner. The palace was already awake. Servants moved in silence, polishing silver, adjusting drapes, lighting fires that smoked faintly before they caught. Every corner seemed to bristle with expectation. Clara felt it pressing against her chest with every step. She walked behind the boy, who was led by his tutor toward the hall. His shoes tapped the stone with the regularity of a soldier's march, but his shoulders hunched with the weight of dread he could not name. She longed to take his hand, but there were too many eyes. Her fingers closed into her palm until her nails bit. Edward walked ahead of them. His stride was steady, each movement practiced, but Clara saw the tension in his back, the taut line of his neck where the morning light caught on his dark hair. He looked every inch the prince, yet she alone could see the cost of it. The doors opened. The great hall unfurled before them, a stage of velvet and judgment. Nobles filled the benches, their silks whispering as they shifted to watch. The Dowager Duchess sat erect near the throne's lower step, a figure carved in steel. The Duke of Armitage loomed further down, eyes already narrowed in triumph, as if he were about to witness the undoing of the man he envied. Clara's breath quickened. She stepped to the side as the boy was guided to his seat, and then she waited in the shadows, close enough to see, far enough to be ignored. The murmur of voices ran like a current. Edward ascended the dais. He stood, hands clasped loosely behind him, posture tall but unyielding. The hall settled. He let the silence build until even the coughs ceased. "My lords, my ladies," he began, his voice clear, carrying not by volume but by command. "You have gathered in answer to rumor. It is my duty to speak plainly, so that no shadow may grow thicker than the truth." A stir ran through the crowd. Armitage's lips curved. The Dowager did not move. Clara pressed her hand against the panel of the wall, steadying herself. "My son," Edward said, "spoke a word that has been carried through these halls with more noise than any toast or decree. He called the woman who cares for him by a name not hers. For this, you have summoned me to account." A lord near the front muttered, "As well you should." Edward's gaze fell on him, unflinching. "Yes, as well I should. Because the word of a child reveals more truth than the polished phrases of men grown old in politics." A wave of murmurs swelled. Clara's throat tightened. She had not known what he would say, only that he had promised to face it. "My son has lost his mother," Edward continued, his voice lower now, forcing the room to lean closer. "He does not remember her voice. He does not recall her hands. What he remembers is absence. Rooms too large, silence too long. He reached, in his grief, for the word that would shelter him." He paused, letting the weight of it fall. His eyes swept the hall, meeting the Dowager's fixed gaze before moving on. "He reached for it because of her," Edward said, and his voice warmed, just a fraction. Enough for Clara to feel the heat of it pierce through the cold. Because Clara Whitfield has given him what duty could not give, what title could not command. She gave him tenderness when the rest of us gave him ceremony. She gave him constancy when the rest of us gave him structure. And if he called her by that name, it was not shameful. It was innocent. It was love. The hall rustled like wind through dry grass. Some shifted uncomfortably, others frowned, others leaned forward with unwilling fascination. Armitage rose. "So you admit," he said, his voice ringing with calculated outrage, "that you allow your household to blur the sacred line between blood and service. You admit impropriety?" Edward did not look away. "I admit humanity." The words struck like a hammer. Clara's heart stopped, then surged. She felt heat on her cheeks. The Dowager's lips pressed tight, but she did not speak. Edward took one step forward, his figure cutting the light from the high windows. "I will not dismiss the woman who saved my son from silence. I will not shame him for speaking the word his heart needed. If this court calls that weakness, let it. I call it truth." For a moment, the room was suspended. No one breathed. Then Armitage's voice cut through, sharp as glass. "Then you disgrace your title. If you will not act, I will bring the matter before Parliament, as I vowed." The words fell heavy, but before Edward could answer, a smaller voice broke through the air. "Don't!" the boy cried, scrambling up from his seat. His voice rang clear, untrained, but piercing. "Don't take her away!" Gasps. The child's face was flushed, his eyes bright with desperate courage. He turned, stumbling across the polished floor, and reached Clara, where she stood half-hidden. His hands gripped hers with fierce resolve. "She's my mom," he said again, loud, trembling. "She makes me safe." The hall erupted, whispers cascaded, protests, disbelief. The dowager closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in recognition. Edward's breath caught. He descended the dais with slow precision, each step an act of decision. He reached the boy and Clara. He placed one hand on his son's shoulder, the other hovering near Clara's arm but not daring to touch. "Enough," he said, his voice low, almost tender, yet carrying to the farthest bench. "Let all of you see. This is not scandal. This is not shame. This is what remains when loss strips away our masks. My son chose the word he needed. I choose it too." Clara's lips parted, her breath quick. Her heart thundered so loud she thought the hall might hear it. Edward turned his face toward her, and for the first time in such a place, let warmth show. "I will not cast her out," he declared. "I will not. And if you call it defiance, then know this. I defy nothing but cruelty." The boy, caught between them, lifted both their hands together, his small fingers closing tight around theirs, binding them in the sight of the court. The gesture was unpracticed, childlike, but it struck like lightning. The nobles saw it, the dowager saw it, Armitage saw it. The symbol was undeniable. Not rumor, not pretense, but a family joined. The hall fell to silence again. Not the silence of command, nor the silence of fear. A silence that acknowledged what could not be argued away. Edward bowed his head once, not to the council, but to the boy and to Clara. "This is the truth," he said, "and I will bear it." The boy's voice, small but certain, broke the hush one last time. "Mom," he whispered, holding fast to her hand as if he could anchor the whole world with it. And in that moment, the word was no scandal, no weapon, no wound. It was a promise. It was a beginning. It was love. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.